Welcome to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Patricia Wirth, who is the Executive Director and CEO of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, a memorial that will be located here in Northern Virginia. Thank you so much, Pat, for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Catherine. It's always a delight to have an opportunity to talk with you and give you the latest and greatest on what's happening with the memorial. And it couldn't be a better time because we are just about to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the certification of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 2020. It is a big deal across our country.
It is, and you have worked diligently trying to put this memorial together to help not only celebrate the numerous women who have, over 7 decades, brought us the 19th Amendment, but also to educate Americans on a part of American history that really has not been given its due. Let's start from the beginning about suffragists. A little mini history lesson on why Americans are suffragists.
Well, yes, Americans are suffragists as opposed to suffragettes. The word suffragette was coined in England prior to the movement in the United States, and it was more or less a pejorative term. It was meant to belittle the women who were fighting for suffrage in England. And those women behaved differently than women in our country did. They got involved in various violent acts. They broke windows, they set fires, they were very rowdy. They put bombs in mailboxes, that sort of thing. When 2 women, American women, who had been part of that movement in England came back to America, they got very involved in the movement here in the United States. Their names were Alice Paul and Lucy Byrne. Alice was a Quaker. She did not believe in violence. And the movement had already been ongoing when she came back from England. And women in the United States did not engage in violent acts. The only violence in the American suffrage movement was when violence was perpetrated against the suffragists. So that's the difference. The suffragettes are the English women and the suffragists are the American women.
And that's something really that Americans as a point of pride should remember, because I have heard it misused and misrepresented. There was a show on Broadway where they use the term suffragettes instead of suffragists. I mean, within the last 3 years. And I'm like, how can Americans not know the difference between these 2 groups of women and their battles to gain the vote an ocean away from each other? I do think it's important. I think it's also important to talk about how we think of Seneca Falls as being sort of the beginning. I mean, I think it actually goes before. There's a close tie between women who were both abolitionists and women who advocated for women's rights to vote. But it really did take 7 decades, and that there were a lot of women and a lot of groups involved, including women of color, also who have probably not been given their due. So talk a little bit about why there was this push to create a memorial that would really try to put an arm around all of these things that many Americans don't know about the history of the women getting the right to vote.
Well, originally, there was a group in Northern Virginia that had been assembled, and they were looking at building a memorial to just a very small group of suffragists that had participated in some activities locally. And as these women, they were part of the Fairfax League of Women Voters. When these women started doing research, they discovered a treasure trove of information that none of them really knew much or anything about, because, as I like to say, because I do presentations all over the country, the suffragist movement is the best kept secret in American history. And why is that? One of our esteemed historians likes to say that the white men who wrote the history books didn't think it was important and they left it out, which is very unfortunate. I can tell you that you're talking to the executive director of an organization that deals with suffrage every single day, 7 days a week, 24/7. And probably maybe 7.5 years ago, I knew who Susan B. Anthony was, and that was it. And I consider myself to be well-read. I consider myself someone who really enjoys history, but I didn't know anything about it either. And even today, when we look at our mainstream history books at all levels of school, elementary, middle, and high school, we find very little, if anything, about the suffrage movement beyond maybe a picture of Susan B. Anthony that you'll find in the progressive era. And it makes people think that it was no big deal to get this amendment, that she kind of single-handedly was responsible for it. And she certainly was one of the great leaders of the movement. But there were over 5 million women who, during this 7-decade period, were involved. So it's a really, really untold story. And the good news is because of the Centennial, there has been a movement across the country pretty much within the last year, somewhat before that, but pretty much within the last year. And as we're getting closer to August 26, it's been ramping up, where there is much more information in mainstream media, on television, in the newspapers, in the movies, videos. Organizations are talking about it. And there are so many more people now that are aware of the suffrage movement, of the anniversary. And so it's really very exciting. The unfortunate thing is that we're finding this celebratory year to take place when our country is suffering, and the world is suffering from a pandemic. And because of that, there have literally been thousands of celebratory events across the country, including one that was to be hosted by the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association, that have either been totally canceled, postponed, and video streaming and Zoom has taken on a new life because it's one of the few ways that we can get more than 10 people in a group to listen to what we have to say. So it's been really sad for me personally to see that this to have happened at all, of course, but certainly this year, because it's like these women have been not recognized for all of these years. And here we finally had an opportunity to shine a beacon on them, and we just really can't do it the way we wanted to.
You're so right about that. I mean, there should have been more celebration and more coverage of this, and the world is just at a different place. For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we're talking with Patricia Wirth. She is the CEO and the Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, and this is a time just getting ready to recognize the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote in this country, August 26th. So let me ask you about some of the other tributes that have been given to this 19th Amendment 100th anniversary celebration. There's a statue that's going into Central Park, and that statue, and there was an article in the New York Times about this statue that's going into Central Park, and I think it's like the only one of real women in Central Park.
Yeah, that's right.
That's exactly right. They've got Alice in Wonderland and fictional characters, but no actual real women. And what's interesting about the three they chose, it's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Sojourner Truth. And it's a woman sculptor who designed and created this piece of statuary. So considering how many women were actually involved in this very long fight to get the right to vote, adding Sojourner Truth, can you talk a little bit about why you think that we have suddenly now decided to elevate the role of Black American women in this movement?
Well, African American women were involved in the movement before the movement was a movement. We look at Seneca Falls. There was the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in July of 1848. But long before that, there were abolitionist groups and other groups that were working to temperance groups. They wanted to stop drinking because husbands were beating their wives. There were, women that wanted to stop slavery, that sort of thing. So the whole idea certainly took root before then. There was only one African American of whom I am aware that was at Seneca Falls, and that was Frederick Douglass. But nonetheless, African American women were involved from the very beginning. This was before the Civil War. This was when slavery was still alive and well. And African American women just didn't have the opportunity to affect themselves as leaders at that time as much as that should have been allowed. But in fact, white women weren't really allowed to do a lot then either. I mean, that was one of the reasons why they had Seneca Falls. The result of that two-day convention was a declaration of sentiments where women wrote out the things that they wanted. They didn't want to be their husband's property. They had to pay taxes if they owned property, but they didn't have the right to vote. So enfranchisement was one of the tenets, platforms that was added to that. So it's been a long haul, but women have always, Black women have always been involved all the way through. So I think in the last couple of years, as more, and part of it is the timing, but part of it is uncovering the history. There has been a lot more history that has been uncovered about what the roles were and who was involved, what the groups were, the organizations that were formed during that period of time. So we have a lot more information to show that African American women, despite the fact that racism was prevalent throughout the entire suffrage movement, that they had a big role in it, and they just didn't stand down, and they should be given a lot of credit. They did not stand down and just sit by and just say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. They kept on keeping on. I give them a lot of credit.
Well, and as you pointed out, there was a close tie between women who were abolitionists and tied to the right to vote, because without the right to vote, you had no power. You could not affect policy change. You couldn't end the discrimination against women or Black Americans without the power to vote. And so the Temperance League, though, is also very interesting, and how the effort by numerous women to get the vote ended up kind of branching off. So it's not this monolithic group of women who hung together and worked in the same way down the same avenue. And so working with the temperance movement also moved the suffrage forward. It moved this effort forward. Explain a little bit about the messaging around temperance and the vote.
Well, I think that women had just had enough. I mean, women had had enough of the effects of drinking. It was, and this was talked about a lot at Seneca Falls, that if you were married, you were your husband's property. And so he really could do what he wanted. If you worked, he could take your paycheck. If you got divorced, he could take your children. And if he wanted to beat the heck out of you just on account of because, he could do that. And by the way, if he didn't like the way you looked, he could put you in an insane asylum and throw away the key. And so it was really all connected. I mean, certainly temperance was part of it, but it was all connected. And later on in the 20th century, the whole concept, and that was early on at the beginning of the formal suffrage movement, but later on in the 20th century, the alcohol industry was not in favor of women getting the vote, because they felt that if women got the vote, They would want to stop the sale of alcohol. And in fact, prohibition was actually passed before women's suffrage was, but they were afraid that that was going to happen. And also during that later part of the movement, large businesses and manufacturers did not want women to get the vote. And why was that? Because they were afraid that if women got the vote, they would want to establish child labor laws, because we had little kids that were working in factories and they were getting hurt, and it was just, no protection for them, and they were taken out of school and they weren't educated. So there were a lot of factors in those who were anti-suffrage. And in fact, Catherine, there were a lot of women who did not want women to get the vote. Not unlike the ERA situation. There were women who felt that getting the vote was a threat to their lifestyle, to their home life, their families, and they felt that they didn't need to vote. They didn't want to vote. Their husbands could vote for them. And I just like to say, well, if you don't want to vote, then don't vote. But for those who do want to vote, let them vote.
You make such an excellent point. For those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. And the change maker I am talking to tonight is Patricia Wirth, who is the CEO and Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. And we are talking about the upcoming 100th anniversary on August 26th of women getting the right to vote here in the United States of America. And so you really make a great point about the fact that even all women did not support the women's suffrage movement. And ERA is a great analogy for how we are still stumbling along, trying to get, basic rights for women enshrined in our Constitution. So up until the 19th Amendment, women were never mentioned in the U.S. Constitution.
That is correct. We were not mentioned in the United States Constitution. That is absolutely correct. And it's a travesty. And that goes back to the 14th Amendment, where there was a lawsuit that was filed against the government, saying that, I don't remember the exact wording. If I had known that this was going to come up, I would have had my Constitution in front of me. But the wording basically, said that it talked about, people or men, and so women wanted to expand the definition of that to mean mankind, women and men, and they lost the Supreme Court, so the fight, so they couldn't vote. And so then they, knew that they did have to have their own amendment, or it just wasn't going to happen. Now, that's not entirely true either, Catherine. There were two, toward the end of the movement, there were two organizations that kind of rose to the top that were fighting for suffrage. One was NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the National Women's Party. And NAWSA, initially, their game plan and strategy as a moderate group was to get the vote state by state. And their leader at the end was Carrie Chapman Catt, and she had offices in every state, and they were working diligently on that to affect voting rights for women state by state. And in fact, in 1920, there were a number of states that did allow women to vote for everything. There were some states that you could maybe vote for school board, and that was it, or you might just be able to vote for in a local election, and that was it. But there were a number of states that allowed women to vote totally for anything upon which one would vote in their state. But the National Women's Party from day one only had one goal, and that was to secure a national amendment, and the reason, national constitutional amendment. And the reason for that, Alice Paul said that if we did not get a national amendment, women in the South would never get the vote. And boy, was she right. At the end of the movement, and when suffrage passed in 1920, it became the law of the land. So whether your state was one of the ones that ratified it to be one of the original 36 or not, it didn't matter. But it became the law of the land. The last state to ratify it, not just because they ratified it, was Mississippi in 1983. 1983. We live in the state of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We did not ratify until 1952. Alice Paul knew exactly what she was talking about. And, you know, there was a lot of controversy. There was white supremacy in the South. And so there were whites that didn't want Black women to get the vote. Black men already had the vote, but because of Jim Crow laws and so forth, they weren't, they weren't allowed to vote, poll taxes and that sort of thing. It wasn't until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 when all of that was done away with. But here we are, circling back. The Supreme Court once again has lessened some of the voting rights rules, and we're seeing voter suppression across the country again. You know, just look at what happened down in Georgia. So it just kind of, the whole issue of voting in our country and there being equality for people to vote is still being debated, and it is still being fought. It's just, it's pretty amazing. But women have got the vote, so that is a good thing. Now we just have to make sure that they're in some kind of a jurisdiction where they can exercise that right.
Yeah, and I think it's been interesting that after 100 years of having the vote, our legislatures in all 50 states are predominated by men. In Virginia, we've only ever had one woman who's won a statewide office in the Commonwealth of Virginia in its history, Mary Sue Terry. So it's kind of like, so women got the right to vote, and we've had it for 100 years. But I don't think it was until, I would say recently, let's say 2016, that suddenly women are not only voting in massive numbers and marching, but they're also running for office and they're winning. And it's about time, because 100 years, a century is a long time to have the vote and not deploy its power to see women represented across the country in elected office.
Now, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I've often said that we really need to see our legislators be much more gender equal. And the reason for that is, I don't know that when there is a vote, it would necessarily change the vote. But the process, I think, would change, because women and men have different perspectives on the same subject matter. And so I think that before a vote would take place, it would be vetted in a much more, in a way that would really look at all of the elements before a decision was made. And so, I've always advocated for that. And yeah, it's been really exciting to see women being elected in all levels of government, and I hope, and we're following the trend in foreign countries. They've been doing it for years, so we're way past due on doing that. But it's nice to see that there certainly is a movement, and what's even great is some of these women are just awesome. I mean, they're just absolutely awesome, and what they bring to the table is terrific. And this is both parties. It's not just one party. It's like both parties. It's just great to see women getting in there and being able to project their perspective on these important issues that affect women that comprise the majority of the people in our country.
It's a different lived experience. It just is a different lived experience. And I think that in our own legislature in Virginia, when you see women like Jennifer McClellan, who was the first member of the House to be pregnant and give birth, and now we have lots of women in the House. I think it was Kelly Converse who was saying they should have a pregnancy caucus because she and Kathy Tran both had babies this summer. I mean, that's new in 400 years of legislative history in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And so people need to understand there is a different lived experience. And these women in our legislature come from all over. And we have an opportunity now that Joe Biden has selected Kamala Harris as his vice presidential running mate to again decide if it's time for women to be in real leadership roles in this country 100 years after we were given the right to go to the polls and decide who we are electing to public office. And so, we're going to take a short break, but I want to, when we come back, talk a little bit more about the memorial itself and your efforts over the years to build a monument that speaks to the many women and the local history. There's a lot of local history having to do with the Silent Sentinels, with the Occoquan Workhouse, and the history that many people living within miles of that memorial have no concept of. And so when we come back from this break, please join me here on Making Change Radio as we talk to Patricia Wirth, who is the CEO and the executive director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association.
This is Radio Fairfax, a public access cable and internet station provided by Fairfax Public Access, a 501c3 organization in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Al Cooper, Brooks Williams, Al Stewart, Cheryl Wheeler, Barlow Guthrie, Chris. Contemporary singer-songwriter folk artists side by side with long-standing esoteric rock performers. That's what Eclectic Hours is. It's music for baby boomers, music where you gotta listen to the words. Eclectic Hours, Sunday mornings from 10 a.m. to noon. James Taylor, Kate Campbell, Joe Cocker, Livingston Taylor, Lucy.
Free for Me, bringing you musical gems rarely heard on the radio. Hear the White Stripes, St. Vincent, and the Hot Melts. Free for Me, Tuesday at 5 on Radio Fairfax.
Let's go down into the subway station where you hear the strangest things. Every Saturday at 4 o'clock on Night Train Memories, Sounds of the Cities.
Want to hear what there is in jazz besides usual big names? Come listen to The Outer View, where you'll hear vocalists, pianists, jazz rock, jazz from foreign countries, and much more, going all the way from the mainstream to the cutting edge. The exploring happens on The Outer View with Jerry Howard, Tuesdays 2 to 3 on Radio Fairfax.
Tired of the same old oldies stations playing the same tracks over and over again? If you want to hear some great 50s music you probably never heard before, come and listen to my show. Colin Davies, the Professor of Rock, here on Thursdays from 4 till 6.
The radio programs aired by FPA reflect the viewpoints of individual producers and do not necessarily represent those of the station, its staff, or supporters.
Like what you hear? Like what you see? Lights, camera, action. Here's your chance to put your voice and talent to use. What are you waiting for? Your show could be the next big hit. Get involved. Attend a free orientation. Learn to create your own radio and television show. We have courses in radio and television production, post-production, and much more. Come volunteer on a show and sharpen your skills. Don't delay. Don't hesitate. Pick up the phone and call us at 571-749-1102 or visit our website www.fcac.org/orientation.
America, your children have an amazing superpower. They can help save lives by not having play dates. That's right. By replacing get-togethers with virtual play dates and video chats, they can help slow the evil spread of germs. And if your superheroes do go outside, make sure they continue their superhero wing by staying 6 feet away from others to protect everyone in America land. Find out more at coronavirus.gov. A message from the CDC and the Ad Council.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Patricia Wirth, who is the CEO and Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. Pat, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and it is a celebratory mood that we are in right now.
Thank you, Catherine, and indeed it is 100 years that the women in our country have had the vote. I mean, it is just a tremendous milestone, And it has been, from my vantage point, because I live, breathe, and eat this every single day, it has really been exciting to just see how the interest in the history has been ramping up, and it's all ages. There are young people that are talking about it, and there's just so many more people that now know about it, that are talking about it. It's predominantly women, but it's not just women. I mean, this is just such a major milestone in our country's history. So yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled. We had hoped to have the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial completed and ready for dedication for the Centennial anniversary. And then the big boogeyman pandemic came along and has put the kibosh on our great plans and those of many across the country on what they were wanting to accomplish this year and get done on August 26th. But nonetheless, we're making progress. We're getting there, and it'll get done. We will persevere. That's what we women do. That's what the suffragists did. It took them 72 years to get the vote. I hope it doesn't take 72 years to get this memorial built, because I won't be here. But we're getting there.
And that's so true. You point something out. It is a celebration deferred, not deterred. So we're going to defer, but the plans are still there. And it's an important history. And I want you to talk a little bit about the proximity of Northern Virginia to Washington, D.C., and why that makes Fairfax County, the Occoquan Workhouse, of particular interest in this is because of the proximity of the women who were protesting, nonviolent protests at the White House, and how they ended up out at the Lorton Workhouse, and why this was a particularly significant place to build a memorial.
Well, I mentioned earlier that there were two factions, different suffrage organization factions, and one of which was the National Women's Party, and they were considered the militant party. Not that they were involved in anything militant or any violence of any kind, but they were very active. They engaged in picketing. They engaged in parades. They were looking to get notoriety, and they wanted to get media attention to bring attention to the cause that women wanted to vote. In 1916, one of the National Women Party members, who was nationally known, her name was Inez Mulholland, had gone to California, where she was giving speeches about the vote, asking women to vote for Republican presidential candidate, because at the time Woodrow Wilson was the Democratic president and he was not in favor of suffrage. And these women really weren't party oriented. It's just that if you were against suffrage for women, they didn't want to vote for you. If you were for it, they didn't care what your political party was. So they just wanted to elect people that wanted women to get the vote. Her name, anyway, Inez was giving speeches. She was a great orator. She was an attorney from New York. She got involved. She came from a very wealthy family, but she was engaged in social services. She was helping women in New York City. She was one of the first members. She and her father were first members of the NAACP when it formed. And she was in California in November of 1916, and she collapsed and she died at the age of 30. And she became the effective martyr for the movement. she was known, everybody that was in the National Women's Party and then some knew who she was, and she was beloved. There had been a parade in DC in 1913. She had led the parade on a big white horse. I mean, everybody knew who she was, and she was beloved. She was the first woman to ever have a wake in the United States Capitol and Statuary Hall. There were thousands of people that came from across the country on Christmas Day, 1916, to commemorate her life. A couple of weeks later, Alice Paul, who was the leader of the National Women's Party, and a couple hundred of their members met with President Woodrow Wilson and once again said to him, "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" And he basically said the same thing that he'd been saying for a number of years. It's up to the states. The states really need to make that decision. There really isn't anything I can do. Well, Alice and her followers went back to their headquarters in Lafayette Square, and there was something that Alice could do. And on January 10th, 1917, the National Women's Party began picketing the White House. Every day, Monday through Saturday. They picketed from 10 in the morning until 6 at night. They picketed in all kinds of weather. They were called the Silent Sentinels. They held banners. Some had sayings on them. Some just had the suffrage colors, the purple, white, and gold. And they just quietly picketed because they wanted to bring attention to the fact that they were advocating for the vote for women, and they were peacefully protesting. And just as an aside, this peaceful protesting effort is something that the civil rights movement and Gandhi both copied from Alice Paul. A lot of people don't realize that. But anyway, I digress. So these women were picketing every day, and to begin with, the president was, mildly amused. He would tip his hat when he went in and out of the White House, and he'd invite them in for tea, and they wouldn't go. And it was just amazing. I mean, these women were out there in every kind of weather. I mean, it was freezing cold, pouring rain. They were out there. They did not miss a beat, and this was not back in the day when they had LL Bean big down jackets and, boots with heaters in them. I mean, this was back in the day when it was cold, it was really, really cold. Woodrow Wilson won re-election, and one of the platforms that he campaigned on was to not get America in World War I. Well, of course, as soon as he got elected, that changed. And the next thing we know, we were involved in World War I. Well, the other suffrage organization, NAWSA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they stopped their effort to win suffrage during that period of time. They stood down. And Alice Paul's group said, "We are not standing down. We are going to continue to protest. Why should we be sending our American boys to Germany to fight for democracy for the German people when women here in America don't have democracy? We don't even have the vote." Well, there were some people that thought that that was treasonous, and they continued to do it. And President Wilson got tired of it. And on June 22nd, 1917, he started having them arrested. To begin with, it was you just need to pay a little fine, and then you can go home, and all is forgiven. Most of the women wouldn't pay the fine because they said, "We didn't break the law." And by the way, what they were arrested for were the trumped-up charges of obstructing traffic on the sidewalk, which isn't even a law, doesn't even exist. Well, women kept coming, and they kept picketing, and they didn't stop. The DC prison system had two facilities. They had a jail in DC proper, and they also had the Occoquan Workhouse in Lorton, Virginia. And they started sending some of the women out there because they just literally didn't have any more room for them in DC. And so women were sent out there. They demanded to be treated as political prisoners, but they weren't. They were treated as common criminals. They were forced to put on prison garb. They were forced to work. It was not pleasant. And they were, fed just horrible food, complete with maggots. They slept on urine soaked mattresses with vomit encrusted blankets. I mean, it was absolutely horrible, the conditions in which these women lived.
And I believe too that there's a documentary about this called Iron Jawed Angels.
Yes.
As well. For those of you who've just tuned in, you are listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. And we are talking with Patricia Wirth, who is the CEO and Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. And Pat is going over for us sort of what led to these women being imprisoned by Woodrow Wilson, who, by the way, not necessarily a great president. Princeton just removed his name from the School of Public Policy because he was a terrible segregationist. And guess what? Very anti-woman, very anti-woman's vote. And so after he decided that he had had enough, we'll pick up the thread that Pat had started about how these women ended up in Northern Virginia in the Occoquan Workhouse.
So they would bring these women in by train, and on the night of November 14th, 1917, a train came in from DC with 33 women on it. The superintendent of the prison had gone down to Quantico and brought a bunch of Marines up. They were not in uniform. And when these women arrived, they demanded to be treated as political prisoners. They were screamed at. They were literally picked up and dragged. The housing for women was a wooden building across the street from the major brick building where the men were housed. They picked up these women from the wooden building and they literally dragged them across the street and threw them into punishment cells. They had not been given anything to eat or drink for more than 36 hours. One of the women had been thrown into a punishment cell and her head hit the end of an iron bed. It rendered her unconscious. Her cellmate was so upset. She thought the woman was dead. She suffered a heart attack. They could not get medical attention. Lucy Burns, who was the starter of the National Women's Party, was there. Lucy spent over 7 months at Occoquan. She was trying to make sure that the women were okay. She was calling out their names. They shackled her to the jail door bars. They shackled her with her hands over her head, and she almost suffocated during the night because they left her up there literally all night, just hanging like that. There's a couple of different stories that I've heard, but the bottom line is word leaked out to the media about this inhumane, unconscionable treatment. And when it hit mainstream media, it went national. It eventually went international. And by the end of that week, the women were all transferred to the prison facility in DC, and by the end of the month, they were all released. This horrible situation became one of the turning points in the suffrage movement because what happened literally a couple of weeks later was when Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and said, I'm thinking that maybe it would be a great idea for these women to get the vote. Now, he didn't talk about the suffragists. What he talked about were the women who were part of the medical corps that had gone to Germany, that had been over there taking care of our soldiers that were wounded. And so he used them as the rationale that, given what they had done, that perhaps it was time for women to get the vote. But he didn't say anything about the about the suffragists at all. And it took from January of 1918 until June of 1919, until both houses of Congress passed the amendment. And then it had to go to the states for ratification. They needed 36 states to ratify. And it went down to the last state was Tennessee, a southern state. Anybody and everybody who ever had any skin in the game, suffrage or no suffrage, wound up in Tennessee. The antis were there, the NASA was there, the National Women's Party was there, and it was just a raucous time. And the lobbying that went on, the drinking that went on, I mean, it was just like it happened yesterday. People, I mean, it just not anything new and different. I mean, it could have been a page out of what happened last week somewhere, but it was really tremendous. There's a wonderful book written by Elaine Weiss called The Women's Hour that focuses on Tennessee. It's one of my favorite suffrage books because she gets into the before then and after then, but it's just a fabulous, I mean, it was a historical book. I think it's 400 or 500 pages, and I couldn't read it fast enough. It's like turning the page. Then what happened? Then what happened? I mean, it was just the research that she did was just absolutely amazing. I love that book.
But when it comes down to it, the hero of the story, an interesting young man, and let's hear it for young people everywhere. Applause, please, because young people do the thing that needs to be done so often, and this is no exception. Tell us about Harry Burns.
Yep, there was this young legislator, Harry Byrne. He was a Republican, and on the day that they were going to take the vote, the way that it worked was if you were against the amendment, you wore a red rose into the chambers. If you were in favor of the vote, you wore yellow rose. Yellow rose was the flower of the suffrage movement. Well, Alice Paul was actually not in Nashville. She had stayed back home because she was still trying to raise money. Carrie Chapman Catt was there. But they called Alice and they said, Alice, we've just done the count. We do not have the vote. We are not going to get suffrage today. Well, when the vote went around and it got to Harry Burns' turn, Harry took off his red rose, put on a yellow rose, and he unexpectedly voted in favor of suffrage. And that one vote is the reason why the 19th Amendment passed on August 18th, 1920. Now, the next day, Harry was interviewed by the media, and he informed everybody at that time that he had received a letter from his mother the day before that said, Harry, you need to do the right thing and you need to help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. And he said, good boys listen to their mother. Now, another aside from that is our organization has a number of partners that have worked with us for years in helping us to fundraise. And one of them is the General Federation of Women's Clubs. Harry's mother was a Federation woman.
So let's hear it for the women who've appropriately raised those boys of theirs.
Oh, yeah.
For those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio. And the change maker we're talking to today is Patricia Wirth, who's the CEO and the executive director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association. And we are talking about the history behind our 100th anniversary celebration of women getting the right to vote in this country, which is August 26th.
So Catherine, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the memorial itself and what elements we are planning to have be part of it and why it's important. There is no national memorial in our country to honor and commemorate the millions of women who fought for the vote for more than 70 years, which in and of itself is just a travesty. Fortunately, there are individual statues and other plaques and so forth around the country, but there isn't one memorial that really looks at the entire movement. And that's what the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is all about. We will certainly talk about the Silent Sentinels, who were instrumental in helping make what they achieved a turning point in the movement. And that's where the name of our memorial comes from, by the way, is that, when these women were jailed and word leaked out, it became a turning point. That's where the name came from, for the memorial. There will be a separate area, a suffragist commemorative wall, and we're going to actually list all of the women who were jailed and were Silent Sentinels. We're actually going to have a wall that they're going to be acknowledged on. And then we're going to have 19 stations, obviously 19th Amendment, 19 stations that are a combination of narrative and graphic and picture stories of the entire movement, from literally before Seneca Falls through a little past 1920. We're going to tell the whole story in pictures and stories about what happened. And I'm very proud to say that our interpretation and design committee that has worked on this for years really went out of their way to ensure that our memorial talks about the diversity that was involved during the movement, because that's important. You can't tell the story without talking about the diversity. And so groups, one of the groups that has been become a partner of ours a couple of years ago is the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. This is a commission that was established by Congress in 2017. And they have been very supportive of our group and become a prime partner with us. They have purchased for us 3 statues that will be in the memorial. And that includes Alice Paul, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Mary Church Terrell. So that we have, our statues are diverse as well, as they should be. They were all exceptional leaders in the movement. And the other thing that the commission has done, it's helped us with, is that because of the Silent Sentinels and because of the picketing, we thought it would be a great idea, not knowing what that meant, to get a piece of the historic White House fence, if that all could become possible. To make a very long 1-year story short, we have been able to acquire a 24-foot piece of the White House fence artifact, and we will be installing that. And they helped us make that happen. The commissioner that happens to be the chair right now was elected to her post with the Department of Interior. The National Park Service is under that. And so she was very instrumental in helping us get that. But that's a big deal. There is no other body anywhere in the country that is going to have part of the memorial.
The White House fence where the Silent Sentinels were. And I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting to note too that people can actually drive through the Occoquan Regional Park. My husband and I drove through the Occoquan Regional Park, which is a lovely drive. You don't have to get out of your car during, coronavirus pandemic. But if you really want to see the lovely location for this memorial being put together, it's a very pleasant drive down 123 to Occoquan Regional Park, and you can go by and see this beautiful memorial that's under construction.
Yeah, and I would certainly like to give a shout out to some of our other partners. Number one is Nova Parks. Occoquan Regional Park, which is actually part of the historic prison grounds where the Silent Sentinels were jailed, oversees Occoquan Regional Park, and they are providing the land and perpetual maintenance for the memorial. So we've been working with them. We've been glued at the hip with them from day one. So it's been a great partnership with them. So we thank them. I mentioned the General Federation of Women's Clubs. We have received donations from many of the clubs, state clubs and local clubs from across the country. Another big supporter has been the League of Women Voters. They have given us a donation on a national level, and we've received donations from their state and local chapters from across the country, so that's really been good. Another organization that has been a great supporter of ours almost from the beginning is the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority. Now, that's an all-Black sorority that started at Howard University in 1913, and the reason for that was Alice Paul, once again, had put together the first women's rights parade in Washington, D.C. And the Howard only had the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority at the time, and the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority didn't want to march under the criteria that Alice had put, which was when you're going to have to march at the back of the parade, and the Alphas didn't really want to do that. But there were a number of women who said, we want to march. We still think it's important to march. We are women, number one. We are women of color, number two. We need to be out there for people to see us. And so 22 brave women broke away from the Alpha Kappa Alphas, and they started the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And I am very proud to say that they've recently made a $100,000 donation to the memorial. So I mean, we are extremely grateful, grateful for that donation, because I thought I had all of the money that we needed to complete this memorial. And we were looking and expecting donations from both the Commonwealth out of their budget for this year and from Fairfax County. And because of the pandemic, the monies that we had expected, which was in the large hundreds of thousands of dollars category, went away. And it was the right thing to do. I mean, lives and livelihoods had to come first. I get that. I appreciate that as a citizen of this community. I get it. But I will tell you, nonetheless, from a personal standpoint, after all of these years, it was pretty devastating. So the memorial is not going to get done this year. It's going to have to be built in stages, and we need a lot of money. So we need a lot of help, Catherine.
Well, we're down to like 30 seconds, Pat. So what I want to do is thank you for all of the information that you have, the history behind the memorial. I want to send people to www.suffragistsmemorial.org, where you can see renderings of what it's going to look like. You can see information about the memorial, and you can decide to, help Pat out and be a supporter of this memorial. Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you to our listeners. You've been listening to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax, 9 p.m. every Thursday night.